I'm in Bradford, the sun is shining. I'm very, very pleased to be hosting this event as part of our Cosmia Festival. Today's research seminar is a talk from Professor Susan Watkins, who lectures in the School of Cultural Studies and Humanities at Leeds Beckett University. She's the author of numerous books and articles, including the recently published Contemporary Women's Postapocalyptic Fiction, which I've just learned she published in March, just before the lockdown, so it felt very timely. And in this seminar, Professor Watkins will be discussing the apocalypse, writing and women's lives, and it has a very, very apt and timely title. The title of the talk is "It's the End of the World as We Know It. Does That Really Matter? Contemporary Women's Post-Apocalyptic Fiction." So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Susan to our online seminar. Hello, Susan.
Hi, Michael. Thanks so much. Thank you very much for asking me. Delighted to take part, and thank you everyone for coming along. So I do have quite a few slides. I hope you can all see those because there are some kind of key quotations and images on them. And as Michael said, hope to leave time for some questions at the end. So absolutely feel free to store up those questions and ask, and be delighted to hear what you think of my ideas. So I just wanted to begin with a series of images from a set of post-apocalyptic films and TV programmes. And I wonder what these images have in common. We've got Will Smith in I Am Legend, Denzel Washington in The Book of Eli, Tom Hardy in Mad Max Fury Road, and Andrew Lincoln in The Walking Dead. And I think the obvious thing to say is that these are all men. And I wonder why so many of these films and TV programmes that are set in an apocalyptic future focus on men. So men who are trying to survive, men who are trying to protect women and children, men who are often trying to rebuild things the way they were before, men who are nostalgic for the world before things changed. And I think we can also see this in fiction. We've just briefly, before the talk proper started, mentioned Cormac McCarthy's The Road. And it's possibly the best example of a novel that fulfills the pattern I've just described. And it was also made into a film. As one review put it, America is a grim, grey shadow of itself after a catastrophe. A man and his young son wander through this post-apocalyptic world, trying to keep the dream of civilization alive. So here the focus is very much on the father-son relationship and whether that will survive. That relationship seems to become the emblem of civilized values. The mother figure in The Road is often ignored. She exists only in flashback, and we learn that she committed suicide rather than face, this post-apocalyptic world that was to come. And the novel also sets up a fairly kind of binary distinction between the good guys and the bad guys. And also this notion of the good guys who carry the fire, the father and the son in The Road, is very much privileging, I suppose, them as the good people, the ones who bear the values of civilization from the life before into the post-apocalyptic environment. Now, Claire Colebrook has come up with the term sextinction, which is obviously a kind of composite word mixing up extinction and sex, or sexuality, to describe the fact that imaginative visions of the end of the world can't seem to move beyond what she calls tiring gender narratives. She says it's precisely here, in the genre of the post-apocalyptic, that the most tiring gender narratives are repeated. One might say that it's easier to imagine the end of the world and the end of capitalism than it is to think outside the structuring fantasies of gender. There must always be an active male heroism driven by a feminine fragility that appears to hold promise of the future. And it's this that particularly interests me about the dystopian and post-apocalyptic imagination. Why does it tend to rely on tiring gender narratives? And how are women writers in particular moving beyond those? So here's an outline of the rest of the talk, if I manage to get through all of this. So first of all, contexts. What is it about our world now that's such fertile soil for the dystopian and apocalyptic imagination? Then genre. How can we describe what sort of fictions these are? And then I want to spend some time on the tradition of women's work in this field, which is often forgotten about. It doesn't come from nowhere. And that involves looking back to earlier writers and then spending some time thinking about The Handmaid's Tale, of course. So where does that book come from? And which texts is Atwood trying to rewrite? I also want to think about why dystopia is so popular with young adult readers, and then look at some more recent apocalyptic fiction by women writing now, finishing up with some key themes in contemporary post-apocalyptic fiction and some really recent novels that have just come out that I think still bear out some of the points that I'm making. So to start with context, what's happening now that explains the popularity of the apocalyptic and dystopian mode? So Slavoj Žižek, the Slovenian philosopher and cultural critic, argues that humanity is now living in what he calls the end times. And in his book of that name, Žižek claims that global capitalism is on its last legs for 4 reasons. So he's kind of borrowing from the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, which the Bible talks about. But instead of plague, war, famine, and death from the Bible, Žižek argues that the 4 things that will bring the world as we know it to an end are climate change, biogenetic change, so how biology is being reshaped by science, unequal distribution of basics like food and water, and social inequality. Dipesh Chakrabarty has argued that our present moment can be characterised by using the term Anthropocene. He says that it's no longer a question simply of man having an interactive relation with nature. This humans have always had. Now it's being claimed that humans are a force of nature in the geological sense. Humans, thanks to our numbers, the burning of fossil fuel and other related activities, have become a geological agent on the planet. Because humans constitute a particular kind of species, they can, in the process of dominating other species, acquire the status of a geologic force. Humans, in other words, have become a natural condition, at least today. So, as a species, I think, he's suggesting that one of the reasons for the condition we find ourselves in is that we are responsible for changing the natural world around us in ways that can't be undone. And there's been a lot of debate in response to his idea about whether it's all humans who are kind of equally responsible. So obviously there are parts of the world and groups of people where they're so disprivileged that they can't be said to have been responsible for the burning of fossil fuel and other related activities. And so some people have objected to the idea that everyone shares in the guilt, if you like, of the Anthropocene and climate change. Similarly, a third context is what's come to be known as posthumanism, which asks us to reconsider our conventional ideas of what it means to be human, and think about how the human might be altered by a consideration of what Donna Haraway terms our kinship or relation to animals and machines. So in our changing world, we can no longer consider ourselves to be superior to or even distinct from animals and machines. So there's much more of a kind of continuum of life forms, from the animate to the inanimate, and different kinds of life forms that are contributing to a redefinition of what it means to be human. And then particularly recently, since the pandemic, according to The Guardian, there's been a surge in what it refers to as pestilence fiction, and other forms as well as literary fiction like the film Contagion. Apparently Contagion became a must-watch early on in lockdown with searches for the movie title spiking on Google in the early months. And commentators have remarked frequently that since we've entered the pandemic, what people are experiencing is that feeling of prescience, that feeling, as we've just been saying about going shopping in the supermarket when there was nothing on the shelves, that we are already familiar from dystopian and apocalyptic culture with what we're experiencing. So moving on then to how we can define the post-apocalyptic genre. Are they best characterised, these texts, as dystopian or apocalyptic or even post-apocalyptic? And what are the differences, I guess, between those terms? So Andrew Tate, in his book Apocalyptic Fiction, has argued that critical readings frequently emphasise two basic shapes for nightmarish, ruined future fictions. The first, frequently referred to as a dystopia, is a world dominated by technology and excessive consumerism that generates endless leisure for a decadent ruling elite and misery for a vast, starving underclass. This kind of society, covertly run by shady bureaucrats who work for corporations rather than for a democratically elected government, is rarely represented as a happy end of history. The alternative vision is of a devastated Earth in which this techno-future has failed and life is simply a brutal struggle eked out by the survivors. Now, I think that actually I probably wouldn't want to make such a hard and fast distinction between those two shapes, as he refers to them, or those two genres, because I think that so many books actually blend those two elements and do so in quite interesting ways. And for anyone who's interested particularly in the religious traditions that lie beneath apocalyptic visions, which isn't something I'm going to spend much time on today, then Andy's book is the place to go to for that. He's really excellent on all the sources within theology for imaginings of the end of the world as we know it. So if we think more precisely about the term dystopia rather than apocalypse, obviously it's an imaginary place or condition in which everything is as bad as possible, but I think a really useful distinction is the one between the critical and the classical dystopia. So this is a distinction that's made by Baccalini and Moylan in their Dark Horizons collection. So for them, the critical dystopia has little space for hope. The classical dystopia has little space for hope and doesn't have any hope outside the pages either. It's just a warning about a pessimistic future. Whereas for them, a critical dystopia allows readers and protagonists to hope by resisting closure. A text like this will maintain the utopian impulse within the work. And then, of course, once you start thinking about these things, having thought they were quite useful, in my case, I then start to think, well, actually, can I think of any dystopias that are completely hopeless? Does that mean that, most of them are actually critical? There's always a tiny space for hope. Otherwise, there's very little investment for the reader. So, as with all these things, a useful distinction, you start to question and wonder about it as you think about it a bit more. And this is something that I think Margaret Atwood is getting at when she comes up with this term ustopia from her Dire Cartographies essay in her collection In Other Worlds. And Dire Cartographies is a brilliant essay, I think. And she makes up this term by combining the two terms, the imagined perfect society and its opposite, as she puts it, because in my view, each contains a latent version of the other. And so that combination of utopia and dystopia in the same text, I think, is a helpful idea. But also, I love the term ustopia because it implicates us as readers. It's about us making the decision, well, what do we find dystopian? What do we find utopian? It kind of hails us, if you like, and asks us to really think hard about this genre. And so I like that implication in that composite word as well. So there is actually a really long tradition of women writing in the dystopian and utopian genre. Charlotte Perkins Gilman's Herland first published in 1915, is relatively well known. So the book describes an isolated society composed entirely of women who reproduce via parthenogenesis, asexual reproduction, and the result is an ideal social order, free of war, free of conflict, no power domination, although, of course, things change when the three men who discover Herland arrive and start causing trouble, if you like. One that's a bit less familiar and from an interesting background is Rokeya Sakawat Hossain's Sultana's Dream from 1905. The word sultana means female sultan or ruler, and Hossain was a Muslim Bengali writer. And in that text, she creates this feminist utopia called Ladyland, in which women run everything, and men are secluded in a mirror image of the traditional practice of purdah. So that's something that's relatively contemporary with Herland, but much less well known. In this country, Gloriana, or the Revolution of 1900, was written by Florence Dixie, who was a campaigner for the vote for women. As a girl, her heroine, Gloriana de Lara, dreams of the day when women will no longer be second-class citizens, will be able to vote, can aspire to any career open to men. She makes a solemn vow in front of her mother, Speranza, that she will make her dream reality or die trying. And then the last on this slide is an Australian text by a woman called Catherine Helen Spence, writing in 1888, so that really is quite early. She imagines life in 1988, so 100 years hence from her point of writing. And I'd just like to kind of bear witness here, thank two former PhD students in the School of Cultural Studies at Leeds Beckett, Danielle Hall and James College, whose research brought some of these examples to my attention when I hadn't come across them previously, which is the great thing about working in this area. People always suggest new texts that you haven't perhaps read before. So recently, before my most recent book, so a few years ago now, I was working on the period 1945 to 1975, so like the middle of the 20th century, that kind of neglected mid-century period which people don't know what to do with. So it falls in between modernism and postmodernism. It falls in between the first and second waves of feminism. It kind of falls between the first, if you like, golden age of science fiction and the new wave of the 70s onwards. So it's an interesting period, and it's one that we did an essay collection on, the history of British women's writing, volume 9, I think it is, 1945 to 1975, and my chapter in that is about British women's science fiction writing from that 30-year period. It's a pretty neglected period in terms of women's writing, but actually, having done the research, it is one in which women's science fiction, dystopian and apocalyptic fiction was still flourishing. So some of these writers people will have heard of: Angela Carter, obviously, Doris Lessing, possibly Anna Kavan, whose Ice is a really interesting book. But others of them are less well known, like Margot Bennett. Her novel, The Long Way Back, from 1954, is a really interesting text. And Jacquetta Hawkes' Providence Island, from 1959, is another interesting one. So it was a period in which I think the distinctions between popular fiction and literary fiction were more fluid, and in which people writing in this kind of speculative fictional mode, whether that be dystopian, utopian or post-apocalyptic, were producing a lot of quite interesting work. And it's work which questions some of those national narratives about identity, and it questions also some of the assumptions we have about science fiction in relation to national identity and in relation to gender. So, for example, Anna Kavan's Ice, which imagines an ice age overtaking the world by the end of the book, is at the same time a narrative about a man's obsessive search for a woman. And what happens by the end of the book is that the end of the world means at one and the same time that no one else can have the woman that he's pursuing. So that, in a sense, the narrative of obsessional stalking, if you like, kind of runs alongside the narrative of the apocalyptic ice age scenario. So that the ice age almost seems to be the logical outcome for this process of stalking and misogynistic chasing a woman that goes on through the narrative. So it's a very interesting book and written in a very interesting way. And then if we continue on this kind of, speedy survey through women's science fiction and speculative writing, we have to pause, I think, at Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale of 1985, which has recently been adapted for television, and also think about the publication of the sequel last September, The Testaments. Because I think it's easy to forget that actually Gilead is a post-apocalyptic society. What's brought about the creation of Gilead is the drastic drop in the birth rate as the result of pollution, explosion of several nuclear reactors, and the spread of disease. So although people think of it as a dystopian text, it actually does also fit the post-apocalyptic model. And if we think back to what Andy Tate said about the two shapes, one going down the dystopian road and one going down the, absolutely disastrous collapse of civilization road, then I guess Gilead is going down the first of those. So if we spend some time thinking about what Atwood has said about speculative fiction, she uses the term in preference to the term science fiction. She says, what I mean by science fiction is things that could not possibly happen. Whereas for me, speculative fiction means things that really could happen, but just hadn't completely happened when the authors wrote the books. And again, this comes from this same collection, In Other Worlds, SF and the Human Imagination, but it's from the introduction rather than the Diacartography's essay. So that distinction that she makes means that the, if you like, the kind of book about, interplanetary warfare with the lizard men from Xenor is science fiction. But for her, speculative fiction is something different from that. It's technological innovation or cultural and social change that hadn't completely happened when the authors wrote the books, but she's kind of pushing through the device of extrapolation. She also famously said in her speculative fiction that she hadn't included anything that hadn't happened somewhere in the world already, in somewhere in society. And again, we might take that as, read and take that as a fair point, but Ursula Le Guin, who's another very interesting, she died recently, woman, speculative fiction writer, wasn't happy about Atwood using this term. She said that the preference for the term speculative fiction is, quote, designed to protect her novels from being relegated to a genre still shunned by hidebound readers, reviewers, and prize awarders. She doesn't want literary bigots to shove her into the literary ghetto. So she challenged her on her preference for the term speculative fiction, saying that, I guess, she's wanting to get the kudos of a term like that and be associated still with literature with a capital L. She doesn't want to slum it with the, with the fans who like science fiction. And I particularly like the phrase ghetto here, because it kind of, it suggests that in a spatial way, the kind of distinctions that Le Guin is kind of not happy with, if you like. So again, Atwood's term, useful, interesting, and Le Guin just makes us kind of question that a little bit in interesting ways, I think. Okay, so in The Guardian, Atwood wrote a piece about how heavily she'd been influenced by both George Orwell's 1984 and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. And I actually think that piece makes it into the In Other Worlds collection too, reworked and edited. She says, in the latter half of the 20th century, two visionary books cast their shadows over our futures. 1984 with its horrific vision of a brutal, mind-controlling totalitarian state. Brave New World, which proposed a different and softer form of totalitarianism, one of conformity achieved through engineered bottle-grown babies and hypnotic persuasion, rather than through brutality, of boundless consumption that keeps the wheels of production turning. Would it be possible for both of these futures, the hard and the soft, to exist at the same time, in the same place, and what would that be like? So she's explaining there, I think, how she's transformed aspects of both of those foundational mid-century texts by men and rewritten them, as she puts it in this second quotation, from the woman's point of view. She says the majority of dystopias have been written by men and the point of view has been male. When women have appeared in them, they have been either sexless automatons or rebels who've defied the sex rules of the regime. I wanted to try a dystopia from the female point of view, the world according to Julia, as it were. And I think that focus on the world according to Julia, or obviously of Fred in The Handmaid's Tale, does totally shift how we read the text. So The Handmaid's Tale is not about production, it's about reproduction. And okay, we could say that Brave New World is also about reproduction, these bottle-grown babies. But The Handmaid's Tale is about the lived and emotional consequences of that, I think, for women, what it's like to experience that. Obviously, in a different way, with the way that Gilead engineers and controls reproduction. And even though the heroine of The Handmaid's Tale, of Fred, does defy the sex rules of the regime by having a relationship with her commander's chauffeur, Nick, we're not actually sure where that leaves her at the end of the novel, or whether in that action she's actually ended up in a very difficult position. We're not sure where she's going at the end of the text, whether she's been a victim of Nick, who's actually a spy for the regime, or whether she's going to escape via the Mayday organisation, or even if the distinction between those two things is that simple. Dystopian visions that draw on Atwood's ideas are still really popular across all forms of fiction and film, really. And they're immensely popular right now, and often particularly so with young adult readers. So we can think about things like Suzanne Collins' Hunger Games trilogy, Veronica Roth's Divergent series. I think that arguably these books and their film adaptations do focus on female protagonists as the heroic central figures. So there is some kind of progress there. They're potentially, at least, beginning to challenge the idea of women as victim. However, they don't usually do much more than invert gender stereotypes. So the women tend to become kind of, powerful and kick-ass rather than weak and feeble. But there's no more complicated or thoroughgoing dispersal of gender conventions. And it's a reversal rather than seeing gender as a spectrum, for example. And they tend to be quite conservative in terms of race and sexuality. So often, if there are black or minority ethnic characters, they're just kind of minor sidekick characters who often get sacrificed during the narrative. And if in sexuality they tend to be fairly straightforwardly heterosexual. So these novels and their film adaptations are going maybe about 2 steps down the road of kind of making things more interesting for women readers and viewers, young women readers and viewers. So these are just 4 interesting contemporary women's post-apocalyptic novels that I've worked on for my recent book. Obviously, I've looked at more than these 4, but these 4 I've just put because they're interesting in different ways. So Octavia Butler's parable novels, published really early, so 1993 to 1998. And they are so prescient right now. They reimagine the USA after a social breakdown and devastating climate change. Butler's heroine creates a new religion called Earthseed, whose only beliefs are that God is change, and that humanity's future lies beyond the stars. But she also imagines a Christian fundamentalist president in the second of the 2, which is absolutely eerie right now. The novel by Nnedi Okorafor, Who Fears Death, she is a Nigerian-American novelist, and the book is set in a post-apocalyptic Africa in what's known as the Seven Rivers Kingdom, that used to be part of the Kingdom of Sudan, where there's entrenched violent tribal conflict. That novel won the 2011 World Fantasy Award for Best Novel. And it's very interesting in terms of ideas about embodiment, the way it reworks the, I suppose, Bildungsroman narrative, and in the way it thinks about human-animal relationships and communication, etc. Station 11, Emily St. John Mandel, was published in 2014. A Canadian novelist, she sets her book amongst a troupe of strolling players who perform Shakespeare's plays across the settlements of the North America devastated 20 years previously by a flu pandemic. And the interesting thing about that book is how it plays around with ideas about high and popular culture, because the group of strolling players perform Shakespeare plays, but another key text within the novel is this kind of pulp comic, Station 11, and the two high and low cultural forms kind of work and play against each other in interesting ways throughout. That won the 2015 Arthur C. Clarke Award and the Toronto Book Award. So again, it's interesting if you think in terms of the prizes that these texts are winning. They're winning, things like the Arthur C. Clarke and the World Fantasy Award, but some of them are also winning really prestigious things in terms of literary fiction, like the Toronto Book Award. And then, of course, Margaret Atwood returned to the speculative mode in her recent trilogy of post-apocalyptic fictions, Mad Adam, all three of which are set after a genetically engineered virus has wiped out almost all of humanity. So, they're just a few of the novelists I discuss in my recent book. Shameless plug here. However, no one is going to buy the book because, like all academic books, you need a small mortgage to afford it. So, but just to kind of, put the cover on a slide, why not? So these are the key themes that I'm looking at. It's organised by issues or theme rather than by novelist or novel, because I do talk about quite a lot of novelists in it. So the introduction looks at how these women writers have rewritten and transformed previous traditions. And then I've got themes on science, nature and matter, the post-human body, the maternal imaginary, time, narrative and history, and literature and the word. And the conclusion just spends a little bit of time on the idea of faith and the post-secular. So that's that. Now, there are two recent novels that I wasn't able to include in my book, but they really echo the themes, which is always nice to do, isn't it? So you kind of think, oh, it's nice to come across something new, but you think, oh, well, basically, they're all doing what I know women's writing does in this genre, but I hadn't read these books yet when I came up with this thesis, if you like, about contemporary women's post-apocalyptic fiction. So, the one on the left is Louise Erdrich's Future Home of the Living God. And she's such an interesting writer. She's from a Native American heritage from the Ojibwe tribe. And she has produced a book in which the world as we know it is ending. This is from the blurb. So I had to include it because that's, the same title. In the novel, evolution has reversed itself, affecting every living creature on Earth. Science cannot stop the world from running backwards, as woman after woman gives birth to infants that appear to be primitive species of humans. 32-year-old Cedar Hawk songmaker, adopted daughter of open-minded Minneapolis liberals, is as disturbed as the rest of America around her. But for Cedar, this change is profound and deeply personal. She is 4 months pregnant. Cedar feels compelled to find her birth mother, Mary Potts, an Ojibwe living on the reservation, to understand both her and her baby's origins. As Cedar goes back to her own biological beginnings, society around her begins to disintegrate, fueled by a swelling panic about the end of humanity. There are rumours of martial law, of Congress confining pregnant women, of a registry, and rewards for those who turn these wanted women in. It will take all Cedar has to avoid the prying eyes of potential informants and keep her baby safe. So again, having read that quite recently, the things that crop up there are this idea of time and evolution reversing itself and twisting. Also, the focus on, again, female reproduction, and particularly on the notion of a maternal heritage. So the heroine is adopted, but she finds her birth mother, and the kind of complications that arise from that are central to the narrative. So that, I think, is a really great example of the kinds of central issues that contemporary women writers in this field are exploring. And the one on the right is Diane Cook's novel, The New Wilderness. Now, that's been shortlisted for the Booker Prize, and I was privileged to interview Diane earlier this year when she was International Writer in Residence at Leeds Lit Fest in March 2020, just a week before lockdown. And it was so strange because Diane flew over from New York, which was obviously at that point suffering much more heavily than we were, and she left a toddler behind to do that. She was incredibly anxious about coming over. She got back just in time before everything kind of collapsed. We secured British Council funding to bring Diane over to write a manifesto for next year's Leeds Lit Fest and to open and close the festival. And her novel, The New Wilderness, is a post-apocalyptic dystopian fiction set in an area away from the city in America called the New Wilderness, where a small group of humans have to live a nomadic existence in harmony with the natural world. And at the same time, they're monitored by mysterious rangers who kind of follow them and make sure that they're not staying in one place too long, make sure that they're not damaging their environment, and keep them moving around the wilderness. And again, there's an emphasis in the book on the experience of mothering in a post-apocalyptic environment. So that one is also definitely worth a look. So, one of the last questions I'd like to ask in this talk is what happens to writing after the apocalypse? And the answer that I'm finding in my research into contemporary writing about the apocalypse is that nearly all women writers imagine writing surviving but also changing after the end of the world as we know it. None of them are actually nostalgic for the past. They're not concerned with the earlier literature. Instead, they're all about embracing change and transformation in the written word, literature and culture. And I think we can see that in the title of Mad Apple, which is, as you'll notice, a palindrome, so that the word reads the same forwards and backwards, and it's suggesting that in the end is the beginning, if you like. And I think this gives us an important clue to how contemporary women's fiction in this post-apocalyptic genre sees society and culture moving on after an apocalyptic event. So, almost without exception, I've seen in these novels that these women writers are suggesting positive futures for humanity after the apocalypse. Rather than yearning for the past or attempting to rebuild in the same way as before, what they're suggesting is that maybe the world as we had it before wasn't so great, and that we need to change things, rework things, rewrite things. So in other words, society and culture can be transformed and revised, just as literature and writing can be revised. Thanks a lot.